Explain the advent of NGOs. Why advent of NGOs? The intention behind the creation of the NGOs was that in places where the government was either doing a bad job of service delivery or the government could not reach for whatever reason, the NGOs could step in and act as the medium between the official sector or the governmental sector and the people. The term non-governmental organizations was coined to describe these entities. Further, the fact that the increasing complexity and multiplicity of problems that confronted the world meant there was a need for a quasi-official entity to step in and help both government and society. Further, the NGO sector is useful to act as a watchdog, to oversee the governmental programs and assess how much the government is effective in addressing them. Moreover, the NGOs can also be focus groups who do not venture into the groundwork but are advisory in nature. These are the public think tanks and advisory councils that routinely come up with policy suggestions. The white papers that are used by the government and other agencies as inputs to their policy-making apparatus. Apart from this, the NGOs can also check the leakage that is inherent in governmental programs because of bribery and corruption, and hence can be the conscience of the people who would report any irregularities in the delivery of public services. Finally, the NGO sector also comprises of volunteers who are committed and dedicated and can come to the rescue of victims of natural disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis, where the governmental and other agencies are overwhelmed and understaffed to deal with the situation adequately. Need for NGOs in social welfare. Many people often wonder about why the NGOs or the non-governmental organizations need to work in the realm of social welfare, as that is the job of the government, as it has a duty and responsibility towards the citizens to promote social welfare. However, ever since the 1970s, governments across the world have been following the dictum of less government is better government, wherein they withdraw from many areas concerning social welfare and instead let private organizations take over health, education, urban amenities, and other infrastructural services. An approach that came to be known as neoliberalism resulted in greater private sector participation in sectors that were traditionally the preserve of governments. Since privatization means that access to services is through a payment-based model for even basic services, the notion that social welfare was being market-driven gained ground. This is where the NGOs the world over stepped in with their objectives of fulfilling the role that the government has to play, but which it decided to abstain. The second aspect about governmental failure, which the NGOs remedied, was in the realm of implementation of policies. Since policies are made for social welfare, the governments have a duty and a responsibility to actualize the noble principles behind such policies. Instead, citizens around the world realized that governments were taking lesser and lesser interest in their welfare, and hence, NGOs stepped into this gap as well. NGOs quickly filled in the gaps in their roles that the government had to play, and these were to do with fulfilling the need for basic services, failure to implement the policies, and third, suggesting and advocating appropriate policies. From the early 1990s, globalization of the world economy meant that the poor and the less privileged were increasingly being shut out of the opportunities presented by the process, as they either lacked the requisite skills or they did not have access to the processes. This is another area where the NGOs stepped in and ensured that these marginalized people had a voice and had someone to speak on behalf of them in the face of the corporate juggernaut. Another area where NGOs could make a difference is in the actualization of social welfare. For instance, many NGOs, like Greenpeace and Amnesty, actively work to persuade governments to adopt certain policies that promote social welfare. Hence, this aspect has to be considered as well when discussing the need of NGOs in social welfare. Employment to youth in NGOs. The urban youth in many countries are vulnerable to several social downsides, like proclivity to crime, substance abuse, low or no employment, and a general sense of helplessness and lawlessness that makes them depressed and prone to antisocial behavior. This is the reason why the urban youth need support and assistance. The ongoing economic crisis has only made conditions worse for the urban youth, as their already low employment levels have been exacerbated, leading to many of them being on food stamps and governmental dole. NGOs have a critical and crucial role to play in assisting the urban youth. NGOs can help them by offering assistance both in monetary and logistical terms, providing them with training on vocational skills, weaning them off substance abuse by arranging de-addiction camps, counseling them against taking to crime. NGOs also work in conjunction with the governmental agencies to assist them in their endeavor to actualize social welfare. This is the reason why NGOs must actively work with the urban youth so that they lead lives that have a semblance of order and resemble normal working adult lives. NGOs can help the urban youth by hand-holding them through the entire life cycle of education and finding jobs for themselves. This means that NGOs can help them by encouraging them not to abandon their studies and by providing scholarships and other assistance. They can ensure that the dropout rate is contained. After this, the next aspect is to help the youth find meaningful employment by providing them with soft loans and monetary help to set up businesses and small establishments that can serve as a source of steady and stable employment as well as income. The key aspect here is that NGOs must monitor these aspects so that continuity and responsibility along with commitment are actualized. By doing these things, the NGOs can help the cause of social welfare and actualize social justice. The key point to be noted here is that the process of building healthier and wealthier communities can be set in motion by a little bit of assistance from NGOs to these vulnerable segments that would go a long way in helping them lead stable and productive lives. NGOs and government social welfare. The phenomenon of the NGOs or the non-governmental organizations entering the field of social welfare accelerated in the 1990s. In earlier decades, though there were several charitable trusts and organizations like Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and Doctors Without Borders, the explosion in the number of NGOs and the concomitant rise in their profile was relatively muted. This aspect of the NGOs taking center stage has been attributed to the failure of the various governments across the world to deliver development and actualize the principles of social justice and social welfare. This is simply because the governments are the agencies tasked with the purpose of social welfare, and because the amount of money that is at the disposal of governments is something even the biggest NGOs cannot match. Hence, the NGOs had to step in and deliver where the governments had failed. This trend became more noticeable in the first decade of this millennium, wherein the NGOs were seen by many as the real votaries of social welfare, with the rise in the failed states of Africa and other parts of the world where governance simply collapsed. However, the government is the best bet to actualize social welfare because it has the size and the scale to reach out to large populations. No matter how much the NGOs try, they simply cannot match the power of the governments in actualizing social welfare. Hence, the implications of this are that the government and the NGOs are in a seesaw battle with each of them trying to outdo the other, where social justice and social welfare are concerned. This is the reason why the governments and the NGOs exist in a state of tension with each other.